Welcome, dear listeners, to another episode here on the English Globe. We are so glad you are with us today, no matter where you are in the world. This podcast is designed not only to give you insight into international politics, but also to help you grow your English listening skills. So every word we share is carefully chosen and explained in a way that you can follow clearly and easily. Before we begin, I want to say thank you for being part of this journey with us.
Yes, dear friends, welcome from me as well. We always feel so happy when we sit down to record because we know people just like you are tuning in, listening closely, and trying to improve your English step by step. Today we have chosen a very powerful and important topic. It is something that is not only political, but also deeply connected to the future of our world. The title of today's podcast is China's Silent Takeover: Influence Without War. It may sound dramatic, but it is a reality many experts talk about today.
That's right, Julia. We often imagine great powers rising through wars, battles, and armies. But what if a country could rise to dominate the world without firing a single shot? What if, instead of tanks and soldiers, influence spread through trade, investments, culture, and technology? That is exactly what many people believe China is doing right now. China is quietly changing the shape of the global order, not by invading countries, but by making deals, by building infrastructure, by using digital power, and by connecting economies in ways that make nations dependent on it.
And this is why today's discussion matters to you, dear listeners. Even if you are living in a small town, even if you are far away from Beijing or Shanghai, the influence of China is already around you. Maybe you use a phone made in China. Maybe you wear clothes produced in China. Maybe the roads in your city are being built with Chinese investment. The idea of a silent takeover means that this influence is so smooth, so quiet, that many people do not even notice it happening until it is already everywhere.
Exactly, Julia. That's the fascinating part. Wars make noise, they bring destruction and fear. But influence through economics and culture often happens silently. You wake up one day and realize your country is buying more from China than anywhere else, or your leaders are signing agreements with Chinese companies, or your children are learning through apps that are Chinese-owned. This is the silent takeover we are talking about today, and it is something the whole world needs to understand carefully.
And we also want to make this clear for you, our listeners, in a way that builds your English at the same time. While we talk about serious topics like global power and politics, we will use simple words, clear sentences, and thoughtful explanations. You don't need to be an expert in politics to enjoy this podcast. You only need curiosity, patience, and the motivation to learn step by step. That is why this conversation is designed especially for you, our global English learners.
Now, before we go deeper into today's episode, we want to ask you for a small favor. If you are listening right now on YouTube, please take a moment to click that like button, because it really helps us grow and reach more learners like you. Also, if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to our channel, The English Globe, so you never miss our new episodes. We upload regularly, and each episode brings you new knowledge and new practice for your English. Subscribing is the best way to stay connected with us.
Yes, and we would love to know where you are listening from. Are you in Asia, Africa, Europe, or maybe America? Are you listening while walking, driving, or sitting at home? Please tell us in the comments below. We always enjoy reading your messages and hearing your stories. You are not just listeners to us. You are part of a community, a worldwide family of people who want to grow, learn, and understand the world more deeply.
That's so true, Julia. And one of the amazing things about the English Globe community is how diverse it is. We have people from Afghanistan, India, Nigeria, Brazil, Germany, and so many other places. Each time we read your comments, we feel the world getting smaller and more connected. In a way, that is also related to our topic today: how connections, not wars, shape the future. The global family of our listeners reflects how the world is linked together. And that's what China has been quietly using to its advantage.
So today, dear listeners, we will take you step by step through this story. First, we will look at history, how China reached this position of power. Then we will move into the economic strategies that make China so strong. After that, we will talk about technology, diplomacy, culture, and the way China avoids war while still expanding its influence. Finally, we will ask, what does this mean for the future, and what lessons can we learn from it? Each part will build on the last, so stay with us all the way.
And remember, as you listen, don't worry if you don't understand every single word. The most important thing is to follow the main ideas. Listening to English, even when it feels a little difficult, is how you grow. Let this be both a lesson in world politics and a training for your listening skills. By the end of this episode, you will not only know more about China's silent takeover, but you will also have practiced English in a deep and meaningful way.
Exactly. So, dear listeners, take a deep breath, relax, and get ready for an exciting journey with us. We are going to explore one of the most important stories of our time. But we are not going to use complex academic words that confuse you. We are going to keep it clear, keep it simple, and keep it focused on helping you learn while you listen. So, let's begin.
Dear listeners, before we can really understand how China is reshaping the world today, we need to step back and look at history. History is the foundation that explains why things happen the way they do. China's current rise is not something that appeared suddenly like magic in the 21st century. Instead, it is the result of centuries of struggle, achievement, and transformation. To see the big picture, we have to look at China's long story of being a powerful civilization, a country weakened by foreign powers, and now a nation rising once again.
Yes, Adam, that is very true. For thousands of years, China was one of the most advanced and influential civilizations on Earth. It had dynasties that built great walls, invented paper, gunpowder, printing, and the compass, and created philosophies that shaped human thought across Asia and beyond. In many ways, China was once the center of the world's economy and culture. But then came a difficult time, a period often called the Century of Humiliation, when China was invaded, colonized, and divided by stronger powers like Britain, France, Japan, and others.
That century of humiliation is so important to remember because it left a deep scar on China's national memory. The country lost wars, was forced to sign unequal treaties, and saw its land controlled by foreigners. Many Chinese people still carry the feeling that their nation was humiliated, and that feeling motivates today's leaders to make sure such weakness never happens again. It is part of the reason why China's rise today is not only about power, but also about pride, dignity, and restoring a sense of greatness that was once taken away.
Exactly, Adam. And after that painful period came the 20th century, when China went through revolutions and struggles. In 1949, the Communist Party, led by Mao Zedong, established the People's Republic of China. Mao wanted to make China strong again, but his methods often caused suffering. The Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution brought chaos, poverty, and fear. But at the same time, they also planted the idea of self-reliance and unity. China survived those storms, and that survival became the foundation for the reforms that would follow.
Those reforms began in the late 1970s under Deng Xiaoping, who is often called the architect of modern China. Deng believed China could not grow strong by isolation. Instead, it needed to open its doors to the world, trade with other nations, and welcome foreign investment. He introduced market reforms, allowed private businesses, and encouraged international trade. This was the real turning point. In just a few decades, China went from being a poor agricultural society to becoming the second-largest economy in the world. It was like watching a sleeping giant wake up.
Yes, Adam. And what makes it even more interesting is how China's rise has been so different from the traditional Western path. In Europe and America, power often came through colonial expansion, military dominance, and wars. But China's leadership, shaped by its history, understood that direct confrontation with the West could be dangerous. So instead of building an empire with armies, China built an empire with factories, trade, and infrastructure. It was a new kind of rise, one that felt quieter on the surface, but just as powerful in its results.
That's right, Julia. And when we think about it, history explains why China has chosen this path. The pain of foreign invasion made Chinese leaders cautious about war, but the memory of greatness gave them the determination to rise again. The reforms of Deng Xiaoping showed that prosperity could come from cooperation with the world rather than isolation. All of these moments, from ancient inventions to humiliation, from revolution to reform, are connected. They are threads in the larger story of how China has returned to the global stage.
And it is not only about economics or politics, Adam. History also explains the cultural confidence we see in China today. Chinese leaders often talk about the Chinese dream, which is the dream of restoring national greatness, lifting people out of poverty, and giving China a respected voice in the world. This dream is built on the past. It is about saying, we were once powerful, we were once weakened, but now we are back. That story is not only told in speeches, but also in schools, television, and daily life, shaping how ordinary Chinese citizens see the world.
Yes, and this is why, dear listeners, understanding history is so important. Without it, the present makes little sense. When you hear about China building railways in Africa, buying ports in Europe, or developing advanced technologies, remember? These are not random acts. They are part of a long journey that began centuries ago. They are driven by memories of loss and dreams of renewal. By looking at history, we see not only what China is doing, but also why it is doing it.
And as English learners, this part of our podcast also helps you practice another skill: connecting the past to the present. When you read or listen to news, don't just focus on today's event. Ask yourself, what came before? Why is this happening now? In English, we often say, history repeats itself, or the past shapes the present. That is exactly what we are showing you here. China's silent takeover is not a sudden surprise. It is the latest chapter in a very long book.
So, to summarize, China's rise today is rooted in three key historical stages. First, the ancient period of greatness, when China was a leading power. Second, the century of humiliation, when foreign powers dominated and weakened it. Third, the modern period of reform, when leaders like Deng Xiaoping opened the doors and allowed China to grow. These three stages are like the steps on a ladder, carrying China from the past into the future. Without them, we cannot understand the silent takeover that is happening now.
That's a wonderful way to put it, Adam. And now that we have laid this foundation, we can move forward. In the next part of our conversation, we will explore how China uses economic power as its main tool of influence. We will talk about the Belt and Road Initiative, investments around the globe, and how money can sometimes be stronger than weapons. So, dear listeners, stay with us, because the story is just beginning.
Dear listeners, now that we have looked at China's history and how it rose again from a period of weakness, let us move into the heart of today's story. If there is one tool that China has used more effectively than anything else, it is economic power. This power does not come with loud explosions or marching soldiers. Instead, it comes with investments, trade agreements, loans, and infrastructure. In other words, money has become the silent weapon that allows China to expand its influence without firing a single bullet.
That is such an important point, Adam. When we think about power, we usually think of military might, but in today's world, economics can be even stronger than armies. China understood this very well, especially after the reforms of the late 20th century. The government decided that instead of competing with the West in war, it would compete in markets. It began to export goods at low prices, flood the world with Chinese products, and gradually create a situation where almost every country depends on China for something important.
Yes, Julia. And this dependency is key to understanding the silent takeover. If your country depends on another nation for food, medicine, or technology, you will think twice before opposing that nation. China's leaders knew this, so they focused on building supply chains that stretch across the globe. Today, many of the things we use daily, phones, laptops, clothes, furniture, are made in China. Even large parts of the global medicine supply depend on ingredients produced there. This is economic influence at its strongest.
One of the most famous examples of this strategy is the Belt and Road Initiative, often called the BRI. This project, launched in 2013, is sometimes described as the New Silk Road, linking China to Asia, Africa, Europe, and even Latin America. Through the BRI, China provides loans to countries to build roads, railways, ports, and power plants. On the surface, this looks like generosity, helping poorer nations build their infrastructure. But at the same time, it creates deep connections and sometimes deep debts that tie those countries closer to China.
And this is why some people call it debt trap diplomacy, Julia. The idea is that when countries cannot repay these large loans, China can take control of key assets, like ports or airports, or demand political loyalty in return. A well-known case is the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka, which was handed over to China on a 99-year lease when Sri Lanka could not pay back its debts. This shows how economics, rather than war, can bring territory or strategic control under China's influence.
That's a powerful example, Adam. But it is not only about debt. The Belt and Road also creates gratitude and friendship. Countries that receive Chinese investment often feel thankful because China builds things that they desperately need. Roads in Africa, power plants in Pakistan, railways in Southeast Asia. These projects improve daily life for millions of people. And when that happens, leaders in those countries may see China as a reliable partner and turn away from Western powers. So influence grows not only through control, but also through goodwill.
Exactly, Julia. And let us not forget trade. China is the world's largest trading nation. Almost every country now counts China as one of its top trading partners. For example, the European Union trades billions of dollars with China every year. The United States, even though it competes with China politically, still relies heavily on Chinese factories for its consumer goods. In Africa and Latin America, China is often the #1 buyer of resources, like oil, copper, and soybeans. This global trade network makes China central to the world economy.
And what makes this influence silent, dear listeners, is that it does not feel like domination at first. When a country builds a military base in your land, you notice it immediately, and it may cause anger or resistance. But when a country builds a road, a bridge, or a school, it feels like help. Yet over time, that help builds dependency. Leaders realize they cannot afford to lose China's support, and slowly, without even noticing, the country's policies begin to align more closely with China's interests.
Yes, and this is why economics is such a clever and effective weapon. It is invisible but powerful, silent but lasting. Wars destroy cities, but trade builds them. Armies bring fear, but investment brings gratitude. By choosing money over guns, China has managed to rise without creating global enemies in the same way other empires did. Of course, not everyone sees it positively. Some call it manipulation or control through debt, while others call it cooperation and partnership. But whichever view you take, the result is the same. China grows stronger.
I think another interesting example, Adam, is Africa. For many years, African countries were ignored by the West or treated mainly as sources of raw materials. China, however, entered with a different approach. It offered to build stadiums, roads, hospitals, and government buildings. Today you can find Chinese construction companies almost everywhere in Africa. These projects are visible symbols of friendship, but at the same time, they tie Africa's future to China's hands. That is influence not through war, but through bricks, steel, and contracts.
That's true, Julia, and it also shows us something about long-term vision. Western countries often focus on short-term gains, like elections every 4 years. But China's leaders plan decades ahead. They know that building a road today may not bring immediate control, but in 10 or 20 years, that road will connect trade, create dependence, and strengthen ties. This patience, combined with financial resources, makes China's economic strategy extremely powerful and unique compared to other nations.
So, dear listeners, when we talk about China's silent takeover, we are really talking about how economics has replaced war as the main tool of influence. This strategy is subtle, slow, and sometimes hidden, but it is deeply effective. If you look around your own life, at the things you buy, the roads you travel, the companies that invest in your country, you may already see China's footprint. That is how influence spreads without people even realizing it.
And as learners of English, this is also a chance for you to expand your vocabulary around global economics. Words like investment, infrastructure, trade, dependency, and debt are key when reading international news. Understanding these words helps you follow global stories and talk about them with others. So by learning about China's strategy, you are not only learning politics, but also learning the language of global economics. That is a valuable skill in today's interconnected world.
That's a wonderful point, Adam. And now that we have explored the economic side of China's influence, in the next section, we will move into another powerful tool: technology and digital influence. From 5G networks to social media apps like TikTok, China is shaping the digital future of the world. This, too, is part of the silent takeover. So, dear listeners, stay tuned, because the story of influence without war is just becoming even more fascinating.
Dear listeners, as we move deeper into our conversation about China's silent takeover, we cannot ignore one of the most powerful forces in the modern world: technology. In the past, nations showed their power with armies, weapons, and large factories, but today, influence often comes through digital networks, smartphones, and social media platforms. China understood this shift earlier than many people realized, and it began to invest heavily in building not just its own technological power, but also in exporting that power to the rest of the world.
That is absolutely right, Adam. Technology today is like oxygen for societies. It is something we cannot live without. From communication to shopping, from education to entertainment, technology is in every corner of our daily lives. China has realized that if it can provide the networks, the devices, and the platforms that people use, then it does not need to control them with soldiers. Instead, influence comes naturally, silently, and invisibly, because people everywhere are depending on Chinese technology without even thinking about it.
One of the best examples of this is Huawei, the Chinese company that has become a leader in telecommunications and especially in building 5G networks. 5G is the next generation of internet technology, much faster and more powerful than what we had before. Whoever controls the 5G networks controls the flow of digital information across countries. That is why many Western nations became worried when Huawei began building networks around the world. They feared that Chinese companies, under government influence, might use this power to monitor or control data.
Yes, Adam. And while Western governments debate about banning Huawei or restricting its reach, many countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America welcomed it. For them, Huawei provided cheaper, faster, and more reliable services than Western alternatives. So once again, China's strategy was simple but effective. Offer something useful at a lower price, and people will accept it. In this way, the digital infrastructure of many nations is now being built not by the United States or Europe, but by China, creating another form of dependency.
And it is not only about networks, Julia. China is also deeply involved in artificial intelligence, facial recognition, and surveillance technologies. These tools are used inside China for controlling its population, but they are also being exported abroad. Countries with weak institutions or authoritarian governments often buy these systems to monitor their own citizens. This creates a world where Chinese technology shapes not only how people communicate, but also how governments control their societies. Influence spreads quietly through cameras, software, and algorithms.
That is a very important point, Adam. But let us not forget about the softer side of digital influence: entertainment and social media. Many of our listeners probably use TikTok, which is owned by a Chinese company called ByteDance. TikTok has become one of the most popular apps in the world, especially among young people. On the surface, it looks like just a fun app for short videos, but when millions of people spend hours each day on it, the app becomes a cultural force, shaping music, fashion, and even political opinions.
Exactly, Julia. And this is where the idea of soft power comes in. If young people in America, Europe, Africa, and Asia are all watching content on a Chinese platform, then China has a silent cultural influence that no military could ever achieve. Some governments have even worried that the algorithms of TikTok could be used to promote certain messages or hide others, which would give China indirect control over what people see and think. Whether or not that is happening, the fear itself shows how powerful digital platforms have become.
And when we think about the future, Adam, this digital influence will only grow. Imagine a world where most of the internet networks are built by Chinese companies, where social media platforms are controlled by Chinese firms, and where artificial intelligence systems are shaped by Chinese researchers. In such a world, China does not need to send armies abroad. It already controls the invisible wires that connect people's minds, businesses, and governments. That is perhaps the clearest example of influence without war.
Yes, Julia, and I think our listeners should reflect on this in their own lives. Dear listeners, think about your phone. Is it made in China? Is the app you use every day Chinese-owned? Is the internet network in your city built by a Chinese company? If you answer yes to any of these, then you are already part of China's digital influence. It does not mean you are controlled, but it does mean you are connected to a system that gives China silent power across the world.
And for you as English learners, this section also gives new vocabulary to practice. Words like infrastructure, dependency, surveillance, algorithm, and soft power are important in today's discussions about technology and politics. These are the kinds of words you will often see in international news articles, and being able to understand and use them will make you more confident when discussing global issues in English. So as you listen, pay attention to how these words are used in context.
That is a great reminder, Julia. And to bring this section together, let us summarize. China uses technology not only to grow its economy, but also to shape the world's digital future. By building networks, exporting surveillance tools, and running popular apps, it creates influence that feels natural but is deeply powerful. This is influence without war, influence without violence, influence through the digital connections that run through our daily lives. That is why technology is such a central part of China's silent takeover.
Well said, Adam. And now that we have explored technology, in our next section, we will move to another key tool: diplomacy and soft power. We will look at how China uses culture, language programs, and international organizations to build its global image. Once again, the focus will be on influence that is silent, smooth, and often unnoticed. So, dear listeners, stay with us. because the journey of understanding continues, and each part adds another piece to this important puzzle.
Welcome back, dear listeners, to another deep dive into our main theme of China's silent takeover. In the last part, we focused on China's economic and technological strategies, how they've become the world's factory, and how innovation is now central to their power projection. But today, Julia and I want to move beyond just numbers, trade, and hardware. We want to explore something more subtle, something less visible, but equally powerful: culture and soft power. This is where influence becomes truly silent, because instead of forcing change, it gently shapes how the world thinks and feels about China.
That's exactly right, Adam. When we talk about soft power, we mean the ability of a country to persuade others to follow its lead without threats or force. Think of it as influence through attraction. China has realized that while hard power, like military strength, is important, it's not enough in today's interconnected world. To win hearts and minds, they need to tell their story, to create narratives that make China look like a trustworthy, reliable, and even admirable partner. And this is where culture, education, media, and diplomacy all come together.
One of the most visible tools of China's soft power has been the rise of Confucius Institutes around the globe. These are centers set up in universities and schools across more than 150 countries to promote Chinese language and culture. On the surface, they look like cultural exchange programs. Students get to learn Mandarin, enjoy Chinese art, festivals, and cuisine. It sounds harmless, even positive. But critics argue that these institutes also push Beijing's preferred narratives, carefully avoiding topics like Tibet, Hong Kong, or human rights. This dual purpose, teaching culture while shaping perceptions, is exactly what makes soft power both fascinating and controversial.
And we should point out, Adam, that soft power works slowly. It's not like an economic deal that gets signed and produces immediate benefits. Instead, it creates long-term goodwill and subtle alignment. Imagine a student who spends years learning Mandarin at a Confucius Institute, then later works in government or business. That person is more likely to view China in a favorable light. Multiply that by thousands of students worldwide, and you start to see how cultural influence can shape future decision-makers without a single soldier stepping across a border.
Another powerful tool is media. Chinese state-owned media outlets like CGTN and Xinhua have expanded globally. They broadcast news in English, French, Spanish, Arabic, and many other languages. Their goal is to tell China's story in a way that competes with Western outlets like CNN or BBC. For some countries, especially in Africa and parts of Asia, Chinese media is often more accessible than Western channels. By providing information that highlights China's achievements and downplays its controversies, these networks help to reframe global narratives.
Exactly, Adam. And beyond news, China invests heavily in entertainment, films, and digital platforms. Chinese movies, TV dramas, and apps like TikTok, known as Douyin in China, have gone global. While TikTok is often seen just as a fun app for short videos, its global reach means Chinese-owned technology now influences how young people worldwide consume content. And through content moderation policies, certain narratives can be emphasized or silenced. That's soft power in action, when entertainment becomes a tool of influence.
Then there's the Belt and Road Initiative's cultural diplomacy. Alongside building roads, railways, and ports, China often funds cultural exchanges, museum exhibitions, or sister city agreements. These may sound symbolic, but symbols matter. They create bonds of friendship that can later translate into political support. For example, when Chinese construction firms build a stadium in Africa and name it a Friendship Stadium, it becomes a physical reminder of partnership. And when cultural exchange programs bring African artists to Beijing, they return home with stories of generosity and cooperation.
But we should be careful not to assume soft power always works the way China hopes. In fact, Surveys show that in some regions, especially in Europe and North America, public opinion of China has grown more negative, partly because of concerns about human rights, transparency, and aggressive diplomacy. This shows that soft power is not guaranteed. It's a long-term battle of narratives. China may be gaining influence in the global south, but in the West, skepticism remains high. The success of soft power depends not only on the message, but also on the credibility of the messenger.
That's an important point. Credibility is everything in soft power. If people believe the cultural promotion is propaganda, it can backfire. For instance, some universities have shut down Confucius Institutes after criticism from academics and politicians who saw them as vehicles for censorship. This means China's cultural influence is both growing and being contested at the same time. It's a delicate balance between genuine cultural appreciation and suspicion of hidden agendas.
And let's not forget diplomacy. China has invested in what's called Panda diplomacy, sending giant pandas to foreign zoos as a sign of friendship. It might sound light-hearted, but these pandas are incredibly symbolic. They create goodwill, attract media attention, and give China a friendly face. Behind the cute animals, though, lies a serious diplomatic strategy. Countries that host pandas often feel a stronger bond with Beijing, and the return of pandas has sometimes even been used as a political signal when relationships sour.
Another subtle layer of soft power is education. More than 500,000 international students studied in China before the pandemic. Universities in Beijing, Shanghai, and other cities now attract students not only from Asia, but also from Africa, the Middle East, and even Europe. When these students return home, they bring with them first-hand experience of Chinese culture and society. That personal connection often translates into political or business ties later. In this way, China is building a global network of alumni who see it as more than just an economic powerhouse.
So if we step back, what does this all mean for our theme of China's silent takeover? It means that China is not only expanding through trade deals, loans, or technology, but also through ideas, stories, and images. This kind of influence is harder to measure, but in many ways, it's more lasting. Because once you change how people think about you, you've built influence that doesn't depend on money or military power. That's why cultural diplomacy and soft power are such important tools in China's playbook.
To sum up, dear listeners, soft power is the silent side of China's strategy. It's in the language classes, the panda gifts, the news channels, the stadiums, and even the short videos on your phone. It doesn't look like a takeover, but it changes perceptions over time. And if the world increasingly sees China as a natural leader, then Beijing won't need to fight wars or force alliances. The influence will already be there.
And that's why we wanted to dedicate an entire section of today's podcast to this topic. Because too often, people focus only on China's military or economic power, and they forget that persuasion can be more effective than pressure. In our next section, we'll dive into how governments are responding to this rise in soft power, what kinds of resistance or acceptance we see in different regions. But for now, we invite you to reflect. How much of your own view of China has been shaped by movies, news, or culture? It's a question worth thinking about.
Julia, when we think about China's rise, technology is perhaps the most fascinating part. It's not just about making cheap electronics anymore. China is becoming a leader in artificial intelligence, 5G networks, and even space exploration. These areas give Beijing not just economic power, but also influence over the digital future of the world. That's why many analysts say the next big competition is not land or resources, but data and networks.
Exactly, Adam. One of the clearest examples is Huawei, the Chinese telecom giant. Many countries use Huawei technology to build their 5G networks because it is cheaper and advanced. But there's a debate. Does using this technology open the door for surveillance? Western governments like the US worry that China could use these systems to monitor communication and collect sensitive information. Whether true or not, the suspicion itself makes the world nervous.
And it's not just about spying, Julia. Control over digital infrastructure means control over the flow of information. If China builds the backbone of internet networks in Africa, Asia, or Latin America, it might influence which companies get access, which apps are used, and even which news spreads more easily. This is what some experts call the digital Silk Road. It's like the Belt and Road Initiative. But instead of highways and ports, it's cables, satellites, and servers.
That's a smart way to put it, Adam. And think about surveillance technology too. China has developed advanced facial recognition systems and AI-driven monitoring tools. Some governments that want to strengthen control over their citizens buy these systems from China. This creates a new export, not just products, but models of governance. In other words, China is quietly spreading its way of managing society to other countries that may admire its efficiency.
Yes, Julia. And that's where the silent part of this takeover comes in. Unlike traditional empires that spread by conquering territory, China spreads by selling ideas, tools, and infrastructure. A country that uses Chinese surveillance cameras, Chinese 5G, and Chinese apps is indirectly tied to China's ecosystem. It becomes harder for those countries to disconnect later because their whole system is dependent. It's like weaving a spider's web where each thread is technology.
And this raises a big ethical question for the world. Do we value cheap, advanced technology more? Or do we protect our privacy and independence more? Some countries, like the US, Australia, and parts of Europe, are banning Huawei and other Chinese firms. But others, like many African nations, welcome them because they see immediate benefits: better internet, lower costs, faster growth. This shows that China is solving real problems for people, and that's why its influence grows.
Dear listeners, I want you to think about your own experience. Imagine your city suddenly gets faster internet, new apps, and cheaper smartphones, all from one country. You'd be happy, right? But years later, you realize that your internet depends fully on that country's company. If they switch it off or change rules, your country has little choice. That's why technology influence is so powerful. It shapes not only today, but the future options of entire nations.
And this is not happening in secret anymore. We all see it. But many ordinary people don't feel it directly, so they don't realize how important it is. That's why Adam and I want to explain this to you in a simple way. China's rise in technology is not just a business success. It's a political strategy. It is about power, control, and the ability to shape the global digital landscape. And this matters to every single one of us listening today.
Dear listeners, as we continue our journey into China's silent takeover, we now reach the stage of global diplomacy and soft power. While technology and economics are powerful, they are complemented by a subtler form of influence, winning hearts and minds through culture, diplomacy, and international collaboration. China knows that if nations view it positively, agreements, trade, and cooperation happen naturally, without pressure or force.
That's exactly right, Adam. Soft power is about attraction rather than coercion. It is about creating a global image of reliability, competence, and cultural richness. One of the key tools for this is the Confucius Institutes, which are now in more than 150 countries. These centers teach Mandarin, promote Chinese culture, and organize events that show China as modern, sophisticated, and friendly. They are subtle, but they build long-term influence among students, academics, and policymakers worldwide.
And it is not just education, Julia. China also invests heavily in media and cultural exchange. State-run media outlets like CGTN and Xinhua broadcast news in multiple languages across continents. These channels highlight China's achievements, from technological progress to poverty reduction, while downplaying controversial topics like human rights issues or territorial disputes. By framing the story carefully, China shapes global narratives and public opinion in its favor.
Another interesting element, Adam, is cultural diplomacy through symbols and gifts. China has famously used panda diplomacy for decades, sending giant pandas to zoos in foreign countries as a symbol of friendship. These gestures create positive public perceptions and often strengthen bilateral relations. Beyond pandas, China funds cultural exhibitions, film festivals, and art programs abroad, helping to build an image of a nation that is not just powerful, but also cultured and approachable.
Julia, soft power also works through participation in international organizations. China has joined or created numerous global institutions, such as the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, to influence global decision-making. By being part of these platforms, China can set agendas, offer loans, and provide development support to countries that may later become aligned with its policies. This kind of influence is invisible to ordinary citizens, but critical in shaping international politics.
And Adam, let's not forget the strategic aspect of scholarships and educational programs. Every year, thousands of students from Asia, Africa, and Latin America study in Chinese universities on scholarships funded by the government. When these students return to their home countries, they carry knowledge, experiences, and often a favorable view of China. This creates networks of alumni who may one day become policymakers, diplomats, or business leaders aligned with China's interests.
Yes, Julia. Soft power is particularly effective because it builds influence that does not rely on threats. While military bases or economic pressure can generate resentment, cultural and diplomatic initiatives create goodwill. A country that admires China is more likely to vote with China in international forums, adopt Chinese technology, or favor trade deals. In this way, influence spreads quietly, without confrontation, and often without the world realizing it until it becomes significant.
And soft power is long-term by nature, Adam. Unlike military operations, which are often short-lived, soft power grows over decades. For example, a student learning Mandarin today may become a government official in 10 or 20 years. That official will remember China positively, and that memory may affect decisions on trade, technology, or international alignment. In this way, soft power is a generational strategy, quietly reshaping the global order.
Another subtle aspect of China's diplomacy is its strategic narrative of partnership with the global South. China presents itself as a partner of developing nations, offering loans, infrastructure, and technology to countries often neglected by Western powers. This creates loyalty, gratitude, and dependence. Even when projects carry risks, many governments welcome Chinese support because it delivers immediate benefits, which is exactly what makes soft power so effective. It combines tangible results with intangible influence.
Finally, Adam, soft power also functions through global perception. China's leaders are aware that reputation matters in international relations. By hosting large events, supporting global health programs, and participating in climate initiatives, China projects an image of responsibility, leadership, and cooperation. Even skeptics cannot ignore its contributions in disaster relief or trade facilitation. This duality, economic and cultural, allows China to expand influence in ways that are hard to oppose openly.
So, dear listeners, when we talk about China's silent takeover, it is not just military bases or investments. It is also this intricate web of culture, diplomacy, education, and media. These efforts build trust, admiration, and alignment. Countries may not feel directly controlled, but over time, their policies, trade choices, and even public opinion can be shaped by China's soft power. It is influence without war, slow and strategic, but extremely effective.
And as English learners, you can also observe this through media. Pay attention to the words used in international reporting about China, the narratives created in cultural programming, and the messages in educational programs. Soft power is all about communication, persuasion, and shaping perception, which makes it a very important topic for anyone learning English and global politics.
That's right, Julia. And in the next section, dear listeners, we will examine the reactions of other major powers to China's rise, the supporters, the skeptics, and the nations trying to balance cooperation with caution. Understanding these reactions will give you a complete picture of how China's silent influence is changing the global stage, one step at a time. Dear listeners, as we continue exploring China's silent takeover, it is crucial to understand how the rest of the world reacts. While China's influence grows through trade, technology, and soft power, many nations are carefully observing, calculating how to benefit without becoming dependent. Some countries embrace cooperation with Beijing, seeing economic opportunity, while others approach with suspicion, worried about long-term strategic implications.
That's exactly right, Adam. Different regions respond differently based on their needs and priorities. In Africa, for example, China is often welcomed for providing infrastructure, loans, and investment. Roads, railways, and power plants built by China improve daily life and boost economies. Leaders appreciate the speed and scale of Chinese support, which Western countries sometimes fail to deliver. Yet, at the same time, some civil society organizations warn about debt risks and long-term dependency.
In Europe, reactions are more mixed. Western European countries like Germany and France cooperate with China economically, trading goods and investing in technology partnerships. But there is also concern over strategic dependency, especially in critical sectors like telecommunications, semiconductors, and energy. Governments are aware that while China provides growth opportunities, reliance on its technology or loans can create vulnerabilities in political and economic decision-making.
And in the United States, Adam, the approach is more cautious and at times competitive. The US acknowledges China's role as a major trade partner, but it also sees strategic threats in technology, military expansion, and global influence. Policies such as restricting Chinese technology companies, reviewing foreign investment, and forming alliances with Indo-Pacific nations are examples of balancing cooperation with countermeasures. America aims to compete economically and technologically without provoking open conflict.
Another interesting example is India, Julia. India shares both cooperation and competition with China. On one hand, China is India's largest trade partner. On the other hand, border tensions and strategic competition in Asia create caution. India has responded by diversifying partnerships with countries like Japan, Australia, and the United States, forming alliances to balance China's growing influence while still engaging economically where beneficial.
And let's not forget Southeast Asia, Adam. Nations like Vietnam, Malaysia, and the Philippines face a unique challenge. They depend on China for trade and investment, but also worry about territorial disputes in the South China Sea. These countries adopt a dual strategy, engaging economically while strengthening regional alliances and military partnerships to protect sovereignty. It's a delicate balance between benefiting from China's resources and maintaining independence.
Africa and Latin America show similar patterns, Julia. Many countries welcome Chinese investment for infrastructure and trade. At the same time, they are aware that dependency can be risky, particularly if debt becomes unsustainable. Some nations have renegotiated loans, diversified partners, or imposed regulations to retain autonomy. In other words, while Chinese influence is attractive, global actors are increasingly cautious and strategic about its long-term implications.
And international organizations are also part of the equation, Adam. China participates in global institutions shaping policies and standards. At the same time, other countries monitor China's growing presence in the United Nations, World Health Organization, and World Trade Organization. These organizations become arenas where influence is contested and alliances are built to prevent dominance by any single power, including China.
Dear listeners, the key takeaway is that China's silent takeover is not uncontested. While its economic, technological, and cultural strategies are highly effective, global reactions are shaping the pace and extent of influence. Countries are finding ways to benefit from China's rise while protecting sovereignty, balancing dependence with strategic partnerships, and creating counterweights through alliances and regulations.
And from an English learning perspective, this section introduces important vocabulary for global affairs. Words like dependency, sovereignty, alliances, countermeasures, and vulnerabilities are used frequently in international news. Listening carefully to these terms in context helps you understand global debates and discuss them confidently in English.
Exactly, Julia. And in our next section, we will discuss the future of China's influence, how trends in economics, technology, and soft power might shape global politics in the next decades. We'll explore potential opportunities, risks, and scenarios, helping our listeners understand what may come next in this complex global story. Stay with us, because the journey is far from over. Dear listeners, as we near the final parts of our podcast, it's time to look forward. We've discussed China's silent takeover, its economic strategies, technological advancements, soft power, and global diplomacy. But what might the future hold? How will this influence evolve in the coming decades? These questions are complex, because the world is changing rapidly, and both China and other global actors are adapting in real time.
That's right, Adam. Predicting the future is never easy, but we can identify some trends. One possibility is that China continues to expand influence quietly, building on its existing networks in trade, technology, education, and culture. If it succeeds, China could become the central hub of global infrastructure, digital networks, and even cultural norms, shaping decisions and behaviors around the world without ever firing a shot.
Another scenario is that pushback grows stronger. Countries that depend on China may start seeking alternatives, forming alliances, and diversifying trade and technology partnerships. For instance, the US, EU, India, and Japan are already collaborating to offer alternatives in infrastructure and 5G networks. If these efforts succeed, China's influence might remain significant, but not as dominant, creating a more balanced multipolar world.
Technology will likely play a decisive role in the future, Adam. Artificial intelligence, digital currencies, surveillance, and global connectivity are becoming central to national power. China is investing heavily in AI research, smart cities, and quantum computing. These innovations could allow China to lead in setting technological standards worldwide. Nations that cannot keep up may find themselves dependent on Chinese technology and systems.
And let's not forget soft power, Julia. Education, culture, media, and diplomacy will continue to shape perceptions over time. Confucius Institutes, global scholarships, international media, and cultural programs will influence the next generation of leaders, professionals, and decision-makers. Even if China faces criticism in some countries, this subtle influence can shape global politics over decades, in ways that are hard to detect immediately.
However, Adam, there are risks as well. Overreach, economic slowdowns, or international backlash could limit China's expansion. If countries perceive dependence as dangerous or unfair, they may implement regulations or seek alternative partners. Domestic challenges, like demographic changes or environmental pressures, could also slow China's growth. So, while the influence is significant, it is not guaranteed to grow indefinitely.
Another potential development is the evolution of global governance. If international institutions adapt, they could create standards and norms that balance China's influence with the interests of other nations. For example, trade agreements, digital regulations, and multinational coalitions could shape the rules of engagement, ensuring that no single country controls critical global systems. This could encourage cooperation while preventing dominance.
Adam, one important trend is public awareness. Citizens around the world are becoming more informed about how dependence on technology, trade, and loans can influence their country's decisions. Social media, investigative journalism, and global research are revealing patterns of influence. This awareness may empower nations to make more strategic choices and resist undue dependence, creating checks on China's soft and economic power.
Dear listeners, the future may also involve innovation in diplomacy. Countries could negotiate new forms of partnerships with China, combining cooperation and caution. Strategic alliances, regional organizations, and multilateral forums can help maintain balance. In other words, the silent takeover is not inevitable. It depends on how nations, businesses, and societies respond to China's strategies.
Finally, Adam, for you as English learners, observing these trends is also an opportunity to improve language skills. Articles, debates, and analyses about China's global role are full of vocabulary related to international relations, economics, and technology. Understanding terms like multipolarity, dependency, soft power, and infrastructure diplomacy will help you engage with global conversations confidently.
So, to summarize this section, the future of China's silent influence is shaped by multiple factors: technology, economy, diplomacy, soft power, and global reactions. There are opportunities for growth, but also risks and resistance. As listeners, it's important to understand that the world is interconnected. The next decades will be defined by strategic choices, partnerships, and the ability of nations to balance cooperation and independence.
And with that, dear listeners, we are ready to move to our final section, where we will conclude today's podcast, reflect on the key lessons, and discuss what China's silent takeover teaches us about global power, strategy, and the importance of awareness in our interconnected world. Stay with us for the conclusion and final thoughts.
Dear listeners, we have now reached the final part of today's podcast on China's silent takeover, Influence Without War. Over the past sections, we explored how China has expanded influence through economics, technology, soft power, culture, and diplomacy. We have also seen how other nations are reacting and what the future might hold. In this final part, we want to summarize the key lessons and reflect on what this means for the world and for each of us.
That's right, Adam. The first major takeaway is that influence today does not always require armies or wars. China demonstrates that economic tools, trade relationships, technological infrastructure, and cultural programs can quietly shape global behavior. A country that controls key resources, builds digital networks, or educates future leaders can gain strategic advantage without firing a single missile.
Secondly, Adam, we have learned that technology is central to this silent takeover. Huawei, 5G networks, artificial intelligence, and digital platforms like TikTok allow China to connect the world through infrastructure and data. These tools create dependencies, influence information flow, and shape perceptions. Countries around the globe are responding by creating alternative technologies, forming alliances, or regulating Chinese technology.
The third key lesson is the power of soft influence. Cultural diplomacy, Confucius Institutes, scholarships, media networks, and even symbolic gestures like Panda diplomacy build trust, admiration, and long-term alignment. Soft power is subtle, invisible to most people, but it can have a lasting impact on the perceptions and decisions of governments, business leaders, and ordinary citizens.
Fourth, Adam, we must consider economic influence. Through trade, loans, and infrastructure projects like the Belt and Road Initiative, China builds tangible connections that benefit other countries immediately, but may create dependency over time. Nations weigh these benefits carefully, balancing short-term gains with long-term strategic considerations. This delicate balance shows how influence without war can still shape global power structures.
Fifth, we saw that global reactions are diverse. Some countries fully cooperate with China, others remain cautious, and many adopt mixed strategies. Europe, the US, India, and Southeast Asian nations are examples of countries navigating opportunities and risks simultaneously. Awareness, strategic partnerships, and diversified trade and technology sources are essential tools to maintain sovereignty while engaging with China.
Another key point is that the future is not predetermined. China's influence will grow in some areas, but pushback, economic challenges, technological competition, and public awareness can limit its dominance. The global system is complex, interconnected, and dynamic. Decisions made by governments, businesses, and citizens today will shape the world's balance of power in the decades to come.
For English learners, this podcast also provides a chance to practice listening and vocabulary related to international relations. Words like dependency, sovereignty, soft power, multipolarity, and infrastructure diplomacy are essential for understanding global affairs. Listening to these words in context helps you use them confidently in discussion, reading, and writing about world politics.
Finally, dear listeners, the overall lesson is that influence can be subtle, silent, and long-term. China's approach shows that power is not just about armies, weapons, or immediate control. It is also about creating connections, shaping perceptions, and offering solutions that people welcome voluntarily. Understanding this silent power is key to navigating our increasingly interconnected world.
And remember, listeners, awareness is the first step. By observing trade patterns, technology trends, cultural programs, and media narratives, we gain insight into global influence and strategy. Being informed helps us understand the world, engage in discussions, and make decisions that matter in both personal and professional life.
We hope that today's podcast has given you a clear, detailed, and beginner-friendly understanding of China's silent takeover. We encourage you to reflect on what you've learned, think critically, and stay aware of the ways influence works around us.
And as always, dear listeners, we would love to hear from you. Please like this podcast, subscribe to our YouTube channel, The English Globe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us where you are listening from and what you think about China's influence in the world. Your feedback is very important to us and helps us create more content for English learners worldwide.
Thank you so much for joining us in this detailed discussion. Remember, understanding global affairs is not only about facts, it's also about patterns, influence, and the ability to see connections clearly.
Yes, Adam. Stay curious, stay informed, and keep learning English with us. Influence is everywhere, but with knowledge and awareness, we can understand it and make smarter decisions. Thank you for listening to The English Globe, and we will see you in the next podcast.